Okay, so how does living in relative peace contribute to the psychological mindsets and the sociological conditioning of this entire generation of millennials? Here's the why. The why is when you're at peace, there's no sense of urgency. When you're at war, if you don't respond to an order immediately, you may die. But when you're at peace and there's no sense of urgency, well, you know what? Then there's time to sit down. Let's discuss what's going on. Let's discuss how are we doing this? What manner are we doing this? What's the effect of doing this? You don't have time to do that in life and death situations. Life and death situations was how my father lived his young adult life from 1939 to 1945. He brought that same conditioning to being the head of the household. And we learned to respect the head of the household because if you didn't follow the voice of authority, well, there was military discipline that went along with it. Or as my father-in-law would say, he was a lifelong educator, a high school principal. He would say that when the students don't respond to the teacher's authority, then as the principal, the highest authority in the school, he would apply the Board of Education to the seat of understanding. That doesn't exist anymore. It's like there's no deterrent, there's no consequences. And part of the reason for that is we have time to sit down and think about it and discuss it because there's no sense of urgency because we're not at war. So, in relative peacetime, baby boomer parents had the time and the freedom to think things through, including their parental model. And you'll recall from the first video, we were talking about how in the 1960s, a new philosophy came out. And the philosophy was, don't bruise the reed. Now you need to know the background behind that. You see, as it relates to the psychology of discipline, what was always said is don't break the reed. In other words, when you discipline a child, you don't break their spirit, you don't break them in half, you don't beat them to a pulp. But you do need to discipline them. Don't break the reed was the traditional thought. Well, baby boomers came up with a new philosophy. And the new philosophy was, oh, no, of course you don't break the reed. As a matter of fact, you don't even bruise the reed. You see, when a reed goes under distress, we're talking about a lot of wind, that can actually start to twist the reed over and it can bruise at the breaking point. So this is where the phrase came from, don't bruise the reed. Now here's another thing. Baby boomers had the opportunity for higher education, university, college, that their parents, the parents of baby boomers, never had. Why? Prior to the Second World War, the people that went to university and college, the white-collared professionals, what we're going to call them, those white-collar professionals usually came from families that were relatively wealthy, the higher classes we called them. Well, if you were my father, growing up in the 1920s, 30s, and ultimately you went to the war, he was probably going to work in the same meat processing factory that his father worked in. Or he was going to work for the railroad. Or he was going to work in a manufacturing firm, which is where my mother's father worked. Because sociologically, where you stand in society is set effectively by what your education level is. And prior to the Second World War, people had one of two opportunities, and they weren't opportunities at all. They were almost forced. If you came from the lower socio-economic strata, then you worked in the meat packing factory or you worked for the manufacturing company. But if you came from a more well-to-do family, you had the opportunity and the expectation that you would take higher learning at university. That all changed at the end of the Second World War. As we said in the first video, there was the introduction of the GI Bill, and the GI Bill made it possible for any veteran to attend university effectively for free, and it extended to their children. Universities grew in size, class spaces increased, more professors, more open spaces, more opportunity. Now, my parents are both very intelligent people, but neither of them graduated from high school. High school was not important if you were going to have a blue-collar job. So why go all the way to grade 12? Especially, sociologically speaking, when the Depression was in effect from 1929 to 1939. Going to school, you didn't get paid money to go to school. You needed to get out of school as soon as possible and get a job to help support the family. In the first video, we talked about my father who delivered groceries on a bicycle for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Believe it or not, in the snow, because he was raised in the Midwest, for $4.50 a week. A week for what might amount to 70, 80, 90 hours a week. That was the Depression. My father would give all of that money to my grandmother. She would give him back 50 cents, and the other, pretty much 90% of his paycheck, went to support the family. He had an older sister who was also fortunate to have a job during the Depression. She gave all of her money to Grandma to keep the family alive. Well, see, we don't have that right now. We live in a first world country where everybody who wants to work can work. Everybody can make an income. We can survive. We're not being threatened by a depression or a world war. And so, with that economic freedom came educational freedom, and the baby boomers poured into colleges and universities more so than any other generation in the history of the world. And in those halls of higher learning, they were exposed to thoughts, new thoughts in sociology and psychology, because almost everybody took Soc 101 or Psych 101, and they heard, don't bruise the reed. Prior to this new thinking, the tradition for children was the Victorian philosophy. Children should be seen and not heard. What that means is, little Kevin at 4 or 5 years old does not interrupt adults if he happens to be in the same room as the adults. That was considered bad social graces, rude, arrogant, impolite. The baby boomers changed all that. We said, hey, little Aaron, little Jana, little Jordan, little Jillian, whatever was on their mind, they got to speak out. We actually encouraged it. So if your entire life as a millennial, your sociological conditioning is that you're allowed to speak openly, irrespective of the ages of the people in the room, well then, psychologically, you come to believe that your opinion is important because you're always empowered and, yes, encouraged to give your opinion, because baby boomers completely eliminated the philosophy that children should be seen and not heard. When they eliminated that philosophy, regrettably, they didn't temper it with why. They didn't teach social graces. So, millennials were raised believing, justifiably so, that whatever came to mind, they got to speak out. And that's what they do in the work world. But in the work world, it is not the family dynamic. In the work world, it's not a parent to child. It is the president to this new recruit. And yet, millennials, relatively speaking, will speak their minds. but it doesn't come across very well in the corporate world because the corporate world is different from the family world. Nobody taught the millennials the difference. And so millennials come across as being too outspoken. They don't listen. It's not that they don't listen, it's just that they speak first. Maybe they speak without thinking. They definitely speak without experience. But they're just voicing their opinion, which was applauded when they were children and throughout their teenage years. And all of a sudden, it's being criticized in the work world. So from a psychological point of view, the millennials are confused. They still speak out because they've been sociologically conditioned to speak their mind and to contribute to conversation. And yet, if you're an owner of a company or if you're a manager, you find that irritating and aggravating. And it creates a sense of angst. And we might come to the conclusion, you can't teach them anything because all they do is interrupt. You can't teach them anything because they already think they know all the answers. One of the major contributing factors as to why millennials come across to those in higher levels of authority as being arrogant or know-it-alls or you can't teach them anything. One of the major, what we call in medicine now, one of the major etiological factors as to why they come across that way and as to why baby boomers and those in authority perceive that millennials are unteachable is because millennials have not been taught social graces. And now we have to ask the question, why don't they know these obvious social graces? Because they're not obvious to millennials. And we touched on that in that first Star Wars video when we said that one of the contributing factors to the difference in perspective between baby boomers and millennials, between the parents of baby boomers and millennials, one of the major contributing factors to the difference of perception is that back in the day, society was more rural and less urban. Baby boomers and the parents of baby boomers were raised in more rural sociological conditions. Millennials were raised in urban sociological conditions. Urban sociological conditions that we explained was almost like cocooning because when you live in a suburban neighborhood, you may not even know the names of the people across the street. And that's the reality, sociologically, for millennials. But the reality for baby boomers and the parents of baby boomers and the generations before that was more community-based. And television only came out in the 1950s. It wasn't widespread in people's households until the 1960s. What that means is that baby boomers born from 1946 to 1964 would have been raised in a situation that socially you would have friends or family over and you would entertain them in the living room. And conversation was important. And it's when you have a group dynamic and conversation is happening amongst many people in a group dynamic that children are taught social graces. But the reality for millennials is they don't have these large family gatherings as part of their normal social structure. So they don't learn group dynamics. And I'll prove to you why they don't understand social graces as it relates to group conversation. And it's because millennials don't know what group conversation is. They know what this is, and they know what this is. And when you communicate in abbreviated forms with 146 characters. And a lot of what you communicate is relatively useless, irrelevant information, like this is what I had for breakfast, or going for a walk with the dog now, or this is what I'm eating. That kind of communication doesn't lend itself to learning the social graces of group dynamics. So, as it relates to the word ignorant, which means unaware, millennials are blissfully unaware of what the proper social graces are in group dynamics, which is why they interrupt, which is why they speak out, which is why they speak on topics they have no experience about. And they do it enthusiastically because they've been sociologically conditioned to contribute. And once you start to understand those etiological factors, you can start to understand the dis-ease that occurs between the generations and how that dis-ease becomes discomfort and it becomes dysfunction. And when we have dysfunction, we have angst and aggravation and adversarial relationships. That's why we say it's Star Wars, the difference between millennials and baby boomers. And in our next video, we're going to talk specifically about how this sociological and psychological conditioning of millennials has lent itself to a situation whereby millennials are completely confused, discouraged, despondent, and ultimately say, oh, if it's like this, I'm going to quit. And why they don't have longevity in the workplace. And it's because of their particular sense of dis-ease and their psychological insecurity based on their sociological conditioning that makes them want to run away and escape from anything that would endanger their psyche. In the same way that the parents of baby boomers during the Second World War learned to avoid danger, whether they were in the military in active combat or whether they were in the streets of London being bombarded night after night and they had to listen to the voice of authority and run to a bomb shelter, in the same way that people will try desperately hard for self-preservation reasons to avoid physical harm, millennials are trying to avoid psychological and emotional harm. And when they feel a sense of dis-ease in the workplace, their answer is to run away and quit.